This is the first conversation that I had with Richard Hodge, and it's the fourth podcast because after we talked, he sent me an email saying, hey, we covered some pretty advanced stuff, but I think we need to really break it down for folks. So I was thrilled. If you have been a long-time listener to the podcast or even a short-time listener to the podcast, you've seen the other three that we've done to kind of reverse engineer our way, but this is sort of the culmination. This is the conversation really about how to make a difference in the world, how to use systems thinking, how to be basically individual, atomized, small, insignificant human beings and still look at the world and say there's no problem too big that I cannot help contribute to a significant solution to. So this is really inspiring stuff. I hope you enjoy it. Without further ado, Dr. Richard Hodge, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Howie Jacobson. A pleasure to meet you. I know we've only, recently met, but I'm so looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Yeah, me too. And I reached out to you because you make so much damn sense, and it's possible to make sense, and it's possible to talk about very complicated things, but it's rare to do both at the same time. And I think I watched a bunch of your videos and read some of your stuff, and the things that really caught me is your beautiful forward motto, which is no problem too big.
Yeah.
And you're not coming at it from a Pollyannish place of wishful thinking or law of attraction. You then get into the nitty gritty of how complex systems work and what are the levers at which we can press to make things move in better directions. And that's what I'd love to explore with you during our talk now.
Yeah, well, look, I look forward to it. I got into this really after 40 years working in large organizations, basically asking hard questions, which really, and often having them thrown back at me saying, yeah, bloody good question, Hodge. Now, why don't you get on and find an answer to it or find a way forward? And that really just got me deeper and deeper into the, complexity science, systems science, and why through really no desire at the outset to go back to university as to why at 45 I ended up starting a PhD. But really because I had approached a particular question. So I was invited into a general's office. I worked for 21 years within defense as a defense scientist. And he said, look, we've got all sorts of bloody problems with defense strategy, big bundle of money, and 4 tribes fighting for it. And I've got this new division that's trying to find a new way forward, and it's got 4 branches within it. And my real fear is that each of those 4 new branches will just go into silos and create little cylinders of excellence. But he says, I get the sense that what we really need is a sort of scientific approach that keeps those 4 working together. And he says, and I've got absolutely no idea what that means, but if you want it, that's your job description. And you go, wow. And so that began a journey for me that really looked at systemic intervention and how you can keep a conversation going that moves a complex organization forward.
It's just as a sort of a brain burp aside, it's so interesting that, what comes out of military culture into the mainstream, it seems like it's both the best and the worst in terms of like very clear senses of, of strategy, of prioritization, of organization. And at the same time, you get these huge boondoggles and debacles and, $21,000 toilet seats and stupid wars. It seems like it's an interesting place to work.
It is. And But one of the things from my perspective, being on the defense science side and being then invited into, work with that two-star general, and his immediate audience were all of the service chiefs and the Secretary of Defense. He basically made the whole enterprise my laboratory, and opened a conversation with the Secretary of Defense, where he said, well, look, okay, Richard, what you're proposing to do for how we bridge the gap between strategy and execution, and lots of organizations, not just defense, has this problem of a gap between strategy and execution. He says it's at least a 3-year undertaking. And he said to me, looked me straight in the eye, he said, are you up for that? Because if you're not, we're not even going to get started. And I think that, that was quite a salutary thing. One, getting top cover, and two, having that top cover realize that these sorts of systemic interventions is about long-term commitment to making the organization better.
So when you use that phrase, the gap between strategy and execution, what comes to mind is the fable of the 7 blind men and the elephant. Right?
Yeah.
So each feeling a different piece. Like I know people for whom, like for myself, I would think, oh, the problem with strategy and execution, it's a communication, soft human problem. I know other people who would say it's it's a systems problem. I know other people would say it's a resource allocation problem. I know other people would say it's a leadership from the top, clarity and charisma problem. But when you say, what do you look at when you see that gap? Like, how do you begin to say, okay, what are the ingredients that have to go into a fix?
Well, I'm going to give you an answer with the benefit of 30 years since that conversation with the general, because I didn't know this at the time. But actually, it's being able to change your paradigm of thought more than anything else. And I would throw out the proposition that perhaps complexity is of our own making, that if we think something is complex, then take that as an indicator that our mental frameworks, our cognitive frameworks, are not suited for the level of complexity of the problem. And therefore, in order to address the problem that we think of as complex, we need to change our way of thinking about it. And because things can be complex, but once you know the way to address it, then complexity, the actual as complexity increases, the cognitive ability to cope goes down. But if we invert that and say, but if the cognitive ability to cope goes up, then complexity comes down. So therefore, I have come to the appreciation that this knowing doing gap really comes to an awareness of what is the nature of that gap that sits between it. And I think that there are 3 things. One, it's really having a solid sense of value and how that is conceived, how it's contributed, and how it's counted. Then with that, of course, the other side of value is that you can now appreciate the consequences more of what you're doing. Is it adding to or subtracting to your appreciation of value? And what it also enables you to do is help filter that which is relevant to what you want to do. Then you can look at stay open to new ways of thinking that are relevant, and use that as a means for bridging into how you can approach things differently.
Okay, I think I need an example here, something concrete to pin value, consequences, and filters for relevance.
Okay, well, let's take what would most people appreciate. Perhaps a health system. and what is it that a health system values. And for the most part, it talks about the value of the human life, and seeking to take that forward and give us good lives. But for the most part, that it comes at a cost, because the notion of human medicine, in the way in which it's conceived, can be really quite a social good when taken down to universal health, that one would think would be a basic human right. But the consequences of how you address that value can show up in how money is spent within that sector. And then you end up with those, particularly like in America, who can afford health, and those who are really unable to do so. And that is happening here in Australia. So the way in which we actually think about health, whether or not it is going to be more universal or whatever, depends on the value system, and everything that's about the health system that we think about is interpreted through that value system. And I talked about this in America one time, and 3 people came up to the podium immediately afterwards and said, "Oh, all very good, Richard, but who's going to pay for it?" Instead of saying, but if you zoom out from the health system per se to going to society at large, then where is the benefit of spending money on a more universal health system? Is actually in society more people available to work, greater productivity and the like, but we don't look at it that way. We've taken an approach of very reductionist thinking that has not enabled us to look at the benefits in a larger system context.
Well, and you also don't get the question of, well, that's all very well, but who's going to pay for it when you're talking about missile systems? We know who's going to pay. That's a given.
That is true. It is part of the the trouble that we're facing. Really is that the world is dominated by reductionist approaches, which breaks problems down time and time again, and then seeks to improve a part and maximize efficiency of the part, with a view that it's possibly that it's contributing to the efficiency of the whole, when actually it could well be reducing the overall effectiveness of the system of interest. And that happens time again.
Yeah. Does an example or two just come to mind?
Well, one that Russell Acuff often uses. He's an American, sadly died in his 90s only a half a dozen or so years ago. But he often talked about an automobile. An automobile is a system of transport to move us from one point to another. Now, you can break that automobile down into its various parts, but none of its parts have the capacity to move us anywhere. The steering wheel, the tires, the engine, even the engine doesn't move itself, let alone move someone else. And so you can have the best engine in the world, but it still isn't contributing to actually moving you, and that it's not until you have the parts and understand how they fit together and connect together that you really appreciate the capacity for an automobile to take one forward, so that you don't necessarily need the best of engines. You don't, otherwise one ends up with every car perhaps being a Rolls Royce, which no one can afford.
Hmm.
Right? And that also happens in a health system. Let's go back to there. I was doing a study in New Zealand and looking at the question of what's the capacity and capability of the New Zealand health system to respond to serious and unusual emergencies. And I was talking to a head of emergency management, so the ED section in Auckland General Hospital. And he said, well, here's my problem. And we walked out of his office around, and there was a bay with 4 empty beds in it. And he said, see those 4 beds? I said, yeah, they're empty. He said, yeah, the accountant was down here yesterday asking why those beds are empty. Because the accountant saw that as money that's being spent that isn't being utilized. So therefore, that it was seeking to find an efficiency. Do we really need those beds? Well, yes, because we don't really know what's going to walk in the door. But the reductionist attitude that appears, and I'm not just picking on accountants, albeit that this example is around accountancy, just couldn't see the bigger picture, that it only took one incident somewhere in the city and they wouldn't have enough beds.
So that
But
reminds me.
pervades the way in which business and in the way in which defense systems occur. And that's really why when you get into procurement in defense in particular, it breaks things down into, multiple requirements, all of which then when you try to use them in the field actually don't fit together quite as well as they should have done.
It reminds me of, I can't remember the author. It was basically a book that I think just sort of came out of the early days of the pandemic, saying that our just-in-time efficiency supply chains actually significantly reduce the security of the system, right, and the resilience of the system because there's no slack.
Quite so. But ask the same people whether they'd be prepared to fly in an aircraft that didn't have triple redundancy on many of its critical features.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Why? Well, really nice. If, a hydraulic line goes for whatever reason, that the pilot's got other options for actually controlling that particular surface. Right? But yet, within our enterprises, that message is lost. I'll go back to the health example in New Zealand. I was working that question with myself and a mate, Les Haynes. And neither of us, I might have doctor in front of my name, but I'm a systems engineer, not a clinician. So we both had, we had a clinical advisor, and he was the head of intensive care in Wellington Hospital. And he said to me, always look at policy. He said, I'll tell you this, bad health policy is more dangerous to my patients than the flesh-eating bug. Right? Because it comes down to, well, is he going to have enough beds? Is he going to have, and particularly in intensive care? And if you do flow-through studies, as we've done in health systems, then frequently intensive care will be where the log jam occurs. But do they have enough ventilators? Do they have enough critical supplies? Do they have enough infection control? All of these things are influenced by policymakers in the head office of enterprises that are chasing efficiencies without, due course of the ripple effect down through the enterprise.
So I've heard from a number of sort of systems thinkers
Yeah.
that the problem is that the human brain, the mind, whatever, the way we have evolved is not set up for systems thinking. And so it's a fairly pessimistic viewpoint. And I love your take.
Well, I disagree. I think that there's a lovely. I think it's naturally set up for systems thinking. However, it's sort of like, if you've seen Sir Ken Robinson's TED talk on how schools kill creativity.
Yep.
Yeah, right. Well, what else have schools done? And the way in which we educate people is to be compliant, right? You will show up on this time, learn this thing, run this test, and I will give you a mark. And if you get enough marks, you will pass this grade, and so on it goes. And that there is no room, by and large, for creative, for the misfits, the people that, Steve Jobs talked so much about as being those that really shifted his company. So I think the same is true for the ways in which we're thinking. It's René Descartes. Sure, made a great contribution through those Renaissance years in terms of his deductive reasoning, but it broke and it almost destroyed any other way of looking at the world, particularly within what we know as the Western world and its Western ways of thinking. And look at the mess that we're currently in, for goodness sake. And a lot of it can be attributed to us having these reductionist ways of thinking that shape entirely the way in which we construct our values and the way in which we contribute to the world. So John Vervaeke and talks about 4 ways of knowing, and that because of the reductionist approach to our education, there's the one way of knowing that is held above all others, and that is propositional knowing. The stuff of science with the axioms, laws, and all of that. But there's 3 other ways of knowing, and then they're nothing new. They were practiced for millennia before the Renaissance, and that is processual knowing about how to do things. And lots of people went in and built cathedrals without having an education per se, right? Mm-hmm. It was master and apprentice model, and that way of tacit knowledge being transferred from the master to the apprentice. There was perspectival knowing, of actually sitting around and having conversations that enabled different ways of looking at the world and embracing those different perspectives. And then participatory knowing, which is that knowing that you can only get through experience. But yet none of that is actually given much credence when everyone is looking for an evidence-based approach, basically meaning a scientific evidence base, which was really where, in my work within defense, I broke that boundary of propositional knowing, right? Let's take it away from the scientists. Let's look at how we can get the wisdom from the crowd and embrace a wider range of perspectives, and then run some experiments that do things that build the participatory knowing, and then how you feed that into your ways of thinking.
So what did that look like? I can't picture participatory knowing in defense.
Okay, and the same can work in almost any other frame, but within defense, I took a systems engineering frame of, you understand the needs, and then from the needs you analyze the requirements, and from the requirements then you can do design, and you can then test and evaluate that to see whether or not to get away from the systems language, I simply went to, why do we have defense? What does defense do? And how does defense do it? And And those were the three questions that then drove me. And I said, but why does defense exist? Well, we don't know. We know basically to provide a level of security, but in what context is it? Where's the threat coming from? What's the nature of the adversity that you need a defense force for? And so I didn't try to answer the why, but created a set of scenarios, and 14 of them. At the one end, it said, well, what's the least intense situations that defense would be involved? And basically, that's humanitarian relief and disaster relief. And then you go all the way up to the other end of the scale and go, well, what's the most intense? Well, if someone landed in Australia and planted their flag and told us to bugger off or tried to put a new set of rules in place, then we wouldn't like that much. So we'd want to do something about it. And now you can think of a range of scenarios anywhere in between that. And all you're doing is painting a ruler, right? Now go to the other side and say, well, how does defense respond in the future? And you go, but technology is moving way too quick. We really don't know. Okay, so if I gave you a bag full of money that was equivalent to today, or 20% more, or 100% more, how would you spend it? And let people just imagine, come up with all sorts of, and then you set up and design a scenario seminar war game, where you go, well, if we had this force in that contingency, how well would it work? And you obviously then create things that really test the military mind in how they would use something new in a situation they hadn't faced before. How would they apply the military appreciation to the sort of work defense would do, and then how would they apply that, and then use their judgment as to whether or not that would be effective. Now, you do one seminar game, and it's sort of interesting because you can deduce what defense would actually do. Do that 40 times, as we did, then you go, well, actually, now we're constantly hearing, for example, that we don't need artillery. We're constantly hearing that we do need small, capable, highly mobile forces, small units, right? And that's consistently coming up. So how does that compare to our current, and there's all sorts of functions in between. How does that compare to our current one? Do we need more or less of that? And so you can use that gaming then as a basis for testing and evaluating what is two hypothetical situations to actually learn what you actually need. Or a more likely, it's probabilistic, high probability that you're going to need forces of this capability. Now, you can do that with health. You can do that with climate change. You can pick your scenario. It really doesn't matter. Why is transient, and the how will be transient as well, because technology is changing so rapidly. But what you really want to learn is what are the core skills that are constantly going to be relevant to you.
So a couple of things came to mind as you went through that scenario. One is like just the audacity of going into the defense world and saying, well, what is defense for? I love how innocent, stupid a question it is, and how valuable for people who have been taking it for granted to the point where they're blinded. Right. to like when you said that, one of the things, thinking back to what I know about Australia, like one of the biggest threats to security have been fires. Right. But the Army does, like, okay, well, we got to do something. So there's a bunch of people, with training to run towards danger as opposed to away from it. And like, maybe they can help, but rather than like, I don't know, do they think about like, if the purpose is security, what about forever chemicals in the water? What about domestic violence? Like, at what I think it becomes a very interesting discussion to kind of put all our assumptions on the table and say what is security and what are the
Yeah.
contexts in which this government is going to address it.
Well, we started that question even one higher from defence. What is it that Australia might be facing in the future? Then what is the military role within that? Because an economic or a health or a education solution might be enough in some situations. And then you go, well, what's the military contribution to that? And then you go, okay, well, look, I just want to play with that for the moment, but not lose sight of the fact that the military has to fit as one of the powers of national powers available to government. And so you get to understand and explore the connectivity of defence within the context of the nation, and then from the military objectives, well, we would need a military to be able to do this. And I can't really give too many examples because much of what was in my brain used to be classified there. But humanitarian relief and disaster relief is part and parcel of that. And generally I say that because countries get mentioned, right? So, and I don't want to go into that space, but you can imagine that, and and then once you get a frame of the sort of things government might ask the military to do, then you go, well, now there's all sorts of ways in which we can spend $100 billion. Where best to lay your bets on and build that core capability, and the I don't want to put it as an accessory, but those capabilities that are crucial to modern warfare, not only today but through to the future.
The second thing that occurred to me is that there's plenty of examples of clearly we can improve this system. I'm thinking of healthcare in the US, but there are entrenched interests that are keeping us from doing so. So when you mentioned, artillery, we need less artillery and more highly specialized small forces. Right. I'm sure there's people who make money off of artillery who don't make money off of specialized small forces. In the US, they have dominated certainly healthcare, probably the military. I don't know
Well, I used the artillery just as an example. And Australia has spent money since on artillery, and I'm not saying they don't need artillery, but some capabilities will fall to the bottom of that scenario-based gaming process. But here's the thing. Who wants to be the chief of army that kills off the artillery corps? Who wants to be the chief of air force that says we're not buying any more manned fighter jets because we can do everything with drones now or with missiles? In fact, we can do it more capably with missiles. Who wants to be that? You see, there's a, what do you want to be known for or remembered for? Oh, yeah, he was the chief that got rid of fighter jets. Yeah, right. So there is that human dimension that you just have to work with in going, it's just one of the complexities or one of the nuances that you have to bring into the complex equation that you're dealing with, that and why you might know that you perhaps don't need to spend money on X, but you don't want to be, because you can do it another way, right? Functionally, you can still do it, but geez, it's fun flying these things.
Yeah, I'm thinking of every small town in America wants a big fire engine.
Yes, or every hospital wants a level of tertiary care that is highly expensive. So and then the challenge is, so where do you position them? And that isn't, always according to population centers.
Mm. Right.
Right? It
And
depends on influence.
yeah. And one of
Yeah.
the issues of healthcare in the U.S. is, the big argument over the past 30 years has been who's going to pay, right? Okay, so for health insurance, who pays?
Sure.
And we've talked very little about what we're paying for,
Right.
right? In terms of how much money is spent on the last 2 weeks of life, how much money is spent on heroic surgeries and orphan pills rather than prevention, simple, undramatic prevention. And it seems like prevention is one of those things that gets, that you think about a lot in terms of, okay, we've got 4 empty beds, but that is there to as an insurance policy against something
Absolutely.
happening. But it's not very sexy. And if you're right, you know, like, if you prevent a pandemic, nobody gives you a medal because no one's going to celebrate something that didn't happen.
You're right. Absolutely right. I've been with chief risk officer, and I won't name the company I was with, that I was working to provide some strategic advice on their vulnerabilities. And I talked about the pandemic before the pandemic came along. Not that I was Nostradamus or anything like that, but it was a risk. Communicable disease is a serious risk. And he said, Richard, I'll worry about the pandemic after I've seen meteorites falling into Port Phillip Bay. So for him, it was, because his value set was such that it couldn't, and his way of thinking was such that it just couldn't penetrate through his value set to being something real and likely to do serious harm, or impairment to the company.
That reminds me of I think one of I think we're both fans of Tyson Yunkaporta,
Yes.
the Australian Indigenous scholar. I was just reading his latest book, Right Story, Wrong Story, and
Yes.
he was talking about the memory systems of indigenous people, and that led me to a book by I think Lynn Kelly, The Memory Code, which he talks about these the songs and the dances that the people will do about this red berry. When the berries are red, you can boil the leaves and get sustenance. But you would never do that except every 100 years or so when there was such a bad drought. Right. But
right.
Right. So, but your chief risk officer is not concerned about pandemics because he wasn't around in 1918 when the last bad one happened.
There you go. And he wasn't in Auckland when SARS landed in that city, you see. So he hadn't had the experiential knowledge that he needed for it to be real. And I think that really then again goes to the reductionist way of thinking, and that would then put such a low probability against that event that they can't even trouble themselves to give it headspace. Whereas in the seminar gaming process, you go, it's not about probability. It's about if it happens, how would you respond? I'm more interested in how you would respond, because that helps tell me the what, right? Because if you remember, we were talking about a why, what, how model, and it's the what capabilities that you have will shape your capacity to respond, and it's your responsibility that really will determine your resilience, determine your sustainability in many ways.
That reminds me of the work of Nicholas Nassim Taleb in
Yes.
Anti-Fragile, who
Yes.
talks about and that's kind of really informed the way I decide whether to take out insurance. Like if I'm going to buy, an iPad and they want to sell me for $150 insurance for the iPad, I now think that unless I only insure things whose loss would be so devastating that I would have trouble recovering. So yeah,
Understood.
I insure my home, right?
Yes.
I insure my health, but
Yes.
like it's just a better bet that if the iPad goes, it's better, economically it's better for me just to buy another iPad than to insure
That's
against
right.
the potential
Well, one of
loss.
the other things I liked about uh, Taleb's work, he was interviewed in about 2013 about what he had learned from Daniel Kahneman, the behavioral economist that won the Nobel Prize based on his work with Tversky and that. But Taleb was asked, so what did you learn from Kahneman? And he said, well, look, what I learned really was that if you can change what people anchor on, you can force them to do anything. And he used the word force.
Huh.
So that's where in my work of late, with the video series that I've been putting out around anchoring on value, is that it's absolutely crucial that however we perceive in the world, however we process the world, we do through a hierarchy of values that are in us. And all I'm saying is, let's make this explicit, right? Let's make this explicit, because then when we are clear on what we value and that we can change this, right? You can change your anchor, but it's sort of like, the governing values and double loop learning and the like. But then you can anchor your questions on why, what, how, and if so much more meaningfully for you to be able to have a conversation about what's relevant, i.e., that you need to be aware of, and how you're going to realize that relevance, i.e., make the world better, having come to that realization. And that anchors around value.
Boy, what just came to me, because I've been, I know about anchoring, but it never landed the way it just did. A lot of the work I do around personal transformation is around memory reconsolidation, which has to do with understanding how our values have been shaped outside of conscious awareness by events. So
Sure.
so an example from a book behind me that I'm in the middle of, Unlocking the Emotional Brain. What's it called? Unlocking the Emotional Brain, right, by Bruce Tucker et al. He has a case story about a very bright man who works in a computer software company, and he's very reticent to share his ideas, even though he cares deeply about the company and he cares about his own advancement. And
Right.
so you think like he's not anchored on the value because he's not acting on it. And it turns out, after self-reflection and examination being led, he views assertiveness as being like his asshole father, who everybody hated because he was the most
Right.
opinionated person. And if I right, and he had to de-anchor from that unconscious learning in order to be able to anchor on I add value and I'm appreciated for it.
Yes. See, now that, and there it is. It's changing the anchor, and then to enable the contribution, and that's a beautiful reflection. And I think that is the key step to address that which attracted you to this conversation in the first place, around no problem too big. Well, it is too big if you're not explicit about where you're anchored. And having those conversations about how we conceive value, how we contribute value, and how we count value are absolutely crucial.
So are there? So let's go there. Let's maybe climate change or whatever else. Maybe climate change is as a systems thinker, you see climate change as a symptom of something even deeper. I mean, I'm looking
Uh,
at.
yep.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll leave.
No, sorry, I'm just going to touch my camera because it's I moved and it went out of focus. But there we are. Okay,
Okay.
admin done.
um, whether we one of the problems is it seems like we're having trouble as a human species agreeing on the values, even just what we want. And I'm wondering if you see is there a core set of values that we can have a conversation around versus right versus left.
I think that I can give you 6 that I talk about, and these have come from some work I did with a group of people to set up a new governance system only about half a dozen years or so ago to improve the seaworthiness of the maritime capability within defence. But the whole notion of worthiness, I think, is really valuable concept or an outcome to hold on to, irrespective of defense, health, and us as an individual. Are we worthy? Is really the something that we would all wish to feel worthy, that in a way that gives our life meaning and enjoyment and fulfillment. And 4 governing values that we had within that program were transparency, mindfulness in the sense of being aware of the bigger picture, so that you could see the nested hierarchy of systems within systems, and understand that what you do here might achieve an effect within your system that you want, but a deleterious effect elsewhere. So be aware of it. So that's the mindfulness piece. Accountability, and accountability from the point of view of, did you do what you said you would do? And if you can't, were you transparent about it? Because then we can have another conversation about the last one of them was collaboration. But I think that there is now 6 years on from that, I've added 2, and one is honesty. So I say, so let's start with the truth, because without which nothing. And then you can go, well, whose truth, right? But it opens the door, as you have that conversation in search of truth, for multiple perspectives, right? And it's then you get that perspectival knowing that's absolutely vital when you're dealing with complexity. So then the truth, then you can go to transparency. So not just the truth, but we want the whole truth, thank you. Just like in a court of law, you cannot cherry pick. Then mindfulness of the whole, then collaboration, because mindfulness of the whole will say to you, you really don't know, you really can't do everything, and you really won't know everything. So therefore you need to collaborate with people in order to address this. Then as you collaborate, accountability, did you do what you said you do? And then knowing that it's complex, you'll know that things will go wrong. And when they do, and when someone fronts up to you to go, oh shit, that didn't turn out well, will you deal with them respectfully and go, yeah, okay. So what have you done about it? How did that impact? Who else needs to be involved? And because if that respect doesn't exist, and that person is then tarred and feathered, honesty and transparency will be the first casualties in the endeavor. So there's a whole interdependency amongst it. So those are my 6. But I think, there could be another 6, but I'd look and encourage people to find the few that we can embody as an individual, but yet they can live in everything that an enterprise does.
I love how elegant it is, how you can sort of trace the sort of chutes and ladders, and there's it's almost it becomes its own closed system that can handle any kind of complexity.
Well, it's a closed system that can work in an open environment. Sort of like DNA inside you, right? And your DNA can be propagated through the generations. In fact, you're carrying you are the product of all of your ancestors, right? And their DNA lives in you. And it's finding that that conception of value that can be the enterprise DNA.
So how do we bring this to climate change?
Well, those 6 wouldn't be a bad start, would it? Let's call bullshit on a few things, but that's been done, but it's not helping, right? So I think we've got to come back and talk about value, that there there is. I'm almost tempted to go all the way back to saying, a helicopter view isn't enough anymore within enterprises. You almost need to, be like, now I've forgotten the astronaut's name that first he was in Apollo 8, that first took that photo of Earth rising. They came around the dark side of the moon, and then boom, there was this blue planet in front of them. All of us should take that view, because the cost of whatever we're doing, if it's not born in our enterprise, if it's not born in our household or our enterprise or our community, it's born somewhere else on that planet. Now, we need to have a set of values, and if we are talking about how we want the world to be for the future, for our future generations, then we need to have an answer to that about how we're going to contribute to it, and almost use that value set as a covenant for life, so that we can then begin to design for life, and not just human life, but all life, because of it's an ecological system. There's a high levels of interdependency, and we've got to break the rationalist mold. But that can only happen, and it will only happen politically, when we stop looking to the politicians for answers, because they've been bought, by the oil companies, and the coal and gas companies. And we've got to look at, well, if I value that for my children, what am I doing, like in this house, to fully electrify the house? And I'm at a stage of life where, yes, I could put a decent system on the roof and make the most of the sunlight, but start to set the example that others are following. And there's such a high take-up of solar within Australia that movement is happening. And the more people do that, the more politicians will follow the people who are voting for them. So I think we've got to come back to looking at community-based solutions. Not trying to make it too big a problem. And if enough communities follow, then that community will vote for their own independent member. And the next community will do the same. And at the last election in Australia, there must have been about 8 new independent members gone into Parliament House federally. And my sincere hope is that another 8 will join them in the next election next year. right? Simply because we're trying to say that at a community level, that we're not treading the old boards. If you're not going to change your way of thinking about how of the world that we want and creating a future for our children and our grandchildren, then we're going to vote very differently for people who will. And the millennial generation, they're the kids. Well, I call them kids. They're obviously in their 30s now. Leaders start inviting them to describe the future, get them involved in that scenario development, get them involved in that seminar gaming, let them run those seminar games, let them create the narrative for your business in the future. And you as a leader, your job is to enable them to create the future that they need, and you'll succeed as a result of that. So and stop buying consultants is another thing I would say. You've hired a lot of bright people. Don't put them in dead end jobs. Get them thinking and working and gaming the future. They'll create it, and it'll be a damn sight better than where we are now.
I love that. I love that. Are there resources for gaming? Because it seems like it's a fun thing to do. I'm imagining that there are computer games that do it very well, but they may not apply to my plumbing supply company or the municipality trying to figure out beach erosion south of Barcelona. Like how do we learn to game well?
Well, look, the way I did when I was doing the seminar gaming in it was at the turn of the century, right? So 1998 to 2001. So we didn't have the computer-based games that are prevalent now. And I would say, by and large, you don't need them. You need to actually, your seminar game it's seminar-based. So therefore, it's conversation-based with a well-facilitated conversation around why we're doing this, how we might approach it, and if we do it that way, what makes it successful. And do that a number of times and see how often similar answers come up and whether or not there is a core group of responses where you go, whatever we do, we absolutely need this group of capabilities within our business or within our enterprise. And that opens the conversation to challenge. So we used to have, and I know, we had, 3 and 4 star generals equivalent play the game one time. And we just put up a sign on the door, leave your rank and your baggage at the door. They didn't like it much, but they did. God bless them. And then at the end of that, the chief of army came up to me and he said, well, Richard, we've been here, and I got them for 2.5 days. So I was bloody lucky. We've, in 2.5 days, come to a set of conclusions that if we'd done it another way, like we used to, we wouldn't have got to in anywhere between 6 and 9 months. Right? Because everything was open to challenge and the conversations were flowing. There weren't position papers or whatever else. There was just a unified approach towards an enterprise outcome.
Well, I'm just it's trivial, but I'm going back to Michael Jackson's "We Are the World." They got
yes,
in the 1980s they got all these pop stars to come, and the Quincy Jones that produced the night. It was like one night of all these top stars, and the sign he posted on the door is "Leave your ego at the door." Says,
lovely.
We're not going to get it done.
Yeah, I remember that. That was a very good documentary. Yeah, and it worked, right? And some people couldn't leave their ego at the door. They went, right,
Right.
I'm out of here.
Yeah.
But most stayed and most contributed and most had, what looked to be an exhausting night, but such a fulfilling event. But that's exactly what can happen. And what that does, I've seen people come into that process with really quite fixed views, and having run through a few games, then looked at the results and gone, but yeah, I wouldn't change any of the decisions I've made, and here we are. And then gone back into Army and changed the language that Army was using in coming into those games. So we know all we need to know to deal with the major problems in the world. We have enough of the right technology. All we need is this process of human connection, and seminar gaming is one way in which you can say, but it's not real. It's not real. We're experimenting with something that might happen, with something that we don't yet have, but we could. But if that appeared and we had that, what would we do? And the focus is on what would we do together. And some branch of an enterprise might say, well, I would normally do this, but I haven't got it. Well, another way of thinking about that is for us to link that with your something else, and these connections just embed themselves, and you go, you know what, I don't know why we haven't done that before. And there's an energy in it. And I've seen new players come in at times, and they wrestle with the process. They go, oh, no, why aren't we doing this? Because again, they're being very deterministic in their way. And I haven't had to explain it after a while. I've seen senior officers get up and go, it's all right, Freddie, just take it easy. Within a day, you'll see exactly what we're doing. Just go with the flow, accept the process, don't fight the process, and focus on your judgment about whether or not, if we did this towards that end, it would make sense, because that's where the real conversation is.
Gotcha. So there are many more conversations I want to have with you to kind of follow up on this one, but I think we've reached a good comma at this point. But could you tell people how they can follow you if they want to learn more about seminar gaming, how they can continue this conversation and exploration?
Well, I'd welcome people connecting me most at the lowest level, with on LinkedIn at Dr Richard Hodge, or go to my website, drrichardhodge.com.
Is that doctor or DR?
DR richardhodge.com. Or shoot me an email at richard@drrichardhodge.com, drrichardhodge.com. And where I'm particularly interested in is around that framework of value and consequences, and then indeed how we look at simple questions like why, what, how, and if. Questions that are framed in those terms that make it accessible, complex issues accessible to anyone. And if you've got a complex issue and you wonder how you might set up a frame of to address it, then I'd welcome having that conversation with you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think next time I hope we can get into the dragonfly model.
Absolutely, we can do that. They exist on that wall. I think Howie's had a little bit of insight into it, and I would look forward to sharing that with your audience as well, because it does pull those various of those threads together.
Gotcha. Well, I want to have you back by popular demand, since since my podcast is in fact an autocracy informed by feedback.
Well, bless you.
So, Richard, thank you so much for taking the
Thank you,
time
Harry.
and
I've enjoyed it.
yeah, and for just giving, creating ways of thinking that provide hope, which is the first thing we need in order to even take a step towards addressing these huge issues.
That is true. And, hope is one thing, and you can have hope through knowing. On the other side, hope doesn't get you to doing. You need a bit of courage to take that step.
Hmm. All right. Well, here's to hope and courage. So,
Excellent.
thank you so much, Richard. I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Howie. Cheers for now.
And that's a wrap. You can find the show notes from today's episode at plantyourself.com/600. That's right, this is episode 600. This podcast has been coming to you since 2014. I was talking to someone today who was very impressed with the decade-long effort that's gone into this, and I actually am too. There's not too many things I've stuck with for this long. And when I look back at the catalog and the amazing conversations I've had and how much I have learned and the great people I've met through interviewing them and the great people I've met who have written to me and commented and turned into this community of people looking for ways of living better on the earth and living better together and raising our vibrations, as they say. Just take a moment to pause and be really grateful for that. So movement news, today's Tuesday. I had a tournament Friday, Saturday, Sunday in the sand at Calafell Beach. It was fine, but man, am I tired now. And man, is my back tight and my legs aching. So I thought that sand was the answer to all my problems, but apparently it's not. I can still overdo it, even running around on sand. So taking it a little bit easy. I don't know if I told you I got a upside down machine or inversion table, as they say. So I've been spending maybe 15, 20 minutes a day on that. I think it's helping. And also just doing mindful breathing into the back, into the tight muscles. And hopefully it'll help because we have another tournament in 2 weeks, regional beach tournament. That's about it for me for right now. Thank you for watching these 4 episodes with Richard Hodge. If this is the first one, or if you haven't seen the other 3, I highly recommend you go back and do that. Those will have been like /595, 6, 7, and 8, I believe. 599 was Simi Ryat, so a little break. And today again is plantyourself.com/600, 600. So who knows where this is going in the future? Maybe we'll talk again at 700 or 800 or 1,000, or maybe not. In any case, I thank you for being on this journey with me. And as always, be well, my friends.